In the autumn dust of Montana, a mountain man whispered 3 words to a starving girl that he never meant to say. She laughed, and the sound opened a wound in him that never closed. Subscribe and ring the bell for more tales of love, courage, and the untamed frontier. There are places in this world where God finished his work and walked away without looking back. Montana Territory in the autumn of 1868 was one such place. Mountains broke through the earth like the ribs of something ancient and long buried. Rivers carved valleys so deep that sunlight touched their floors only a few hours each day. Pine grew so dense along the ridgelines that wind moving through them produced a sound like breathing, as though the land itself slept and resented being woken. This was not country that welcomed human beings. It tolerated them the way a river tolerates a stone, by flowing around it, by grinding it down, by reminding it constantly that the water arrived first, and would remain long after the stone was powder. The men who lasted in this wilderness were not civilized men. Cold had shaped them, altitude had shaped them, distances so vast that loneliness became a physical thing, a weight lodged in their chests beside the heartbeat. They trapped beaver, marten, fox. They traded pelts at outposts that materialized and vanished with the seasons. They spoke to other men seldom, to themselves without ceasing, and to God only when the silence grew too crushing to bear alone. Elijah Cord was one of these men, 39 years old, built from the same granite as the peaks he lived among, wide shoulders, thick forearms, hands capable of setting a steel trap in frozen earth, or stripping an elk hide in under 20 minutes, or coaxing flame from wet wood that would have broken weaker men into surrender. His face had aged past its years, a dark beard shot through with early grey. Deep creases, flanking eyes trained on snow glare, mountain sun, and horizons that demanded a man see farther than most ever need to look. A scar traced his left jawline where a grizzly had taught him, 7 years prior, that he was not the deadliest creature in these mountains. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black, the kind that swallowed light instead of throwing it back. Eyes that had witnessed enough to fill several lifetimes, and had decided somewhere along the way that revealing what they'd seen served no purpose. He lived alone, had always lived alone, not because loss had stripped someone from him, but because he had never encountered anyone worth the exposure that companionship demanded. The mountains were sufficient, the silence was sufficient, the turning of seasons, the rhythm of traps and trading posts, sufficient. He repeated this to himself so often he nearly believed it. The outpost at Bridger Creek passed for civilization within 100 miles. A trading post, a blacksmith, a saloon pouring whiskey harsh enough to strip rust from iron, and often employed for exactly that. A scattering of tents and shanties where miners, trappers, and drifters converged twice yearly to exchange what the wilderness provided for what it could not. Elijah rode into Bridger Creek on the 15th of October, a mule behind him loaded with furs and a list held in his mind. Salt, powder, lead, coffee, flour. Plain things. The provisions of a plain life that asked nothing of anyone and owed nothing in return. The town was busier than usual. A wagon train had halted on its westward push. Its travelers mixed with trappers and miners in that uneasy combination born when people heading somewhere collide with people who have stopped going anywhere. He noticed the crowd near the general store first, a small gathering, not the eager cluster of entertainment, the stiff, reluctant cluster of witnessing, the kind that watches something ugly because looking away demands a moral choice they are not ready to make. He tied his horse and moved closer. Not out of concern, the crowd stood between him and the store, and his supplies waited inside. Then he saw her. She sat in the dirt beside the wooden steps of the general store, not by choice. She sat because standing was something her body could no longer manage. She carried the kind of thin that comes from going without, not the wiry frame earned through labor, the slow erasure of a body feeding on itself, keeping the heart and lungs alive while surrendering everything else. Her dress had been blue once. Now it wore the particular grey of fabric, beaten against creek stones too many times, bleached by a sun that kills colour the way drought kills grass. Dark hair hung matted around a face streaked with road grime and bone-deep fatigue. She might have been 22. She might have been younger. Hunger and miles had stolen any certainty of her age, but her eyes remained clear. Brown eyes holding something that starvation and exhaustion and whatever hell had delivered her here had failed to kill. The crowd murmured. A woman alone at an outpost carried specific meaning for specific men, and none of that meaning involved mercy. The store owner stood on the steps above her, arms folded. He had told her twice already she could not sit there. She hadn't moved because movement cost energy. She had stopped manufacturing that days ago. Elijah did not know why his feet carried him toward her rather than past her. 2 decades of solitude had drilled into him a single, reliable principle. Other people's troubles had edges, sharp ones, edges that opened the skin of anyone fool enough to handle them. His life was clean, simple, free of those edges. He wanted it that way. But his boots moved forward as though his body had reached a verdict without consulting his mind. He stood over her, this enormous mountain man in his scarred leather coat, fur lashed to his mule, silence pooled behind his eyes. He looked down at this girl in the dirt who weighed less than his winter pack. She was sinking into the ground beneath her, as if the earth had already begun reclaiming what starvation would soon deliver. The words left him before thought could intervene, before the part of his brain that had kept him breathing and solitary for 20 years could remind him that silence was always the safer road. "Can I buy you?" He meant food. He meant provisions. He meant the simple, practical offer of a man who understood barter, currency exchanged for goods, a transaction with no weight beyond its function. But the words his mouth produced were not the words he'd intended. They were clumsy, graceless, the words of a man so long removed from human speech that the machinery had seized. What came out was broken, wrong, and carried a meaning he never chose. The crowd heard those words. The store owner heard them. The men nearby heard them and understood them exactly as such words would be understood at a frontier outpost where women were scarce and morality bent like green wood. She heard them. She lifted her face from the dust. Those brown eyes found his dark ones, and in the gap between one heartbeat and the next, something happened that neither of them anticipated. She laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a mocking one, not the practiced, defensive laugh of a woman who has learned to wield humor as a shield against men who see her as commodity. A real laugh, genuine. The startled, involuntary, delighted sound a person makes when absurdity overwhelms the body before the mind can catch up. A laugh rising from a belly that held nothing. A laugh that filled the air around the general store, rebounded off plank walls, and reached the ears of every soul present. But it entered Elijah Cord differently. It passed through a door he never knew was there. A door lodged somewhere behind his ribs that 20 years of mountains and silence and ruthless self-reliance had not sealed as completely as he believed. The laugh slipped through and found something inside him that had never been found. Something soft. Something that had survived the grizzly and the winters and the crushing weight of solitude because it had been buried so deep that even he had forgotten its existence. It was there. His soul cracked, not loudly, not with spectacle, the way ice fractures on a spring river, a sound so faint that only the water beneath it knows the world has shifted. But the crack was there, and through it poured something warm, something he carried no word for because he had never once required one. He stood there, frozen. This enormous man who had stared down charging grizzlies and crossed frozen rivers and endured the hollow scream of mountain winters alone. He stood over a laughing, starving girl in the dust and felt the entire architecture of his existence shift beneath his boots, like bedrock that had always held, until it didn't. __quote _0 __, she said once the laugh faded. Her voice was raw from thirst and long silence, but every word landed clean. They carried a dignity her circumstances should have crushed. They hadn't. "I meant food," he managed. "I meant, can I buy you food?" She studied his face. She took in the scar, the weathering, the confusion, and beneath all of it, the genuine, bewildered honesty of a man who had spoken the wrong words for the right reason. "Then say that," she answered. Something shifted at the corner of her cracked lips, the ghost of a second smile trying to form. Her name was Nora Callahan. She gave him this over a plate of stew he bought at the outpost kitchen. She ate slowly because her stomach had forgotten abundance and needed reintroduction by degrees. She had traveled west with a family not her own, worked for them, cooked their meals, scrubbed their pots, minded their children through the long crossing. When that family reached Bridger Creek, the husband decided that feeding one extra mouth was a luxury the frontier would not tolerate. He turned her out with nothing. No coin, no supplies, no justification beyond the cold arithmetic of survival in a country where compassion cost dearly and selfishness came free. She had survived at the outpost for 11 days, sleeping beneath the general store, eating whatever scraps she could scavenge, which amounted to almost nothing. Waiting for a wagon train that might carry her further west, or a miracle that might carry her anywhere at all. Elijah listened. He was practiced at listening because it demanded silence, and silence was his mother tongue. He absorbed her story the way he absorbed the mountains, with patience, with care, with the recognition that spoken words mattered less than what lived underneath them. He offered her work at his cabin, 30 miles north, deep in the mountains, cooking and keeping the homestead while he ran his trap lines, fair wages, separate quarters, the clean professional arrangement of a man who needed help with domestic work he had fumbled through badly for 20 years. That was what he told her. That was what he told himself. But the crack had already opened, and warmth was bleeding into regions frozen so long they had forgotten what thaw even was. She accepted, because the alternative was dirt beneath the general store and the slow, patient hunger dismantling her one day at a time. They rode north into the mountains. She sat on the mule among bundled furs. He walked alongside his horse and spoke nothing for 3 hours. She did not press him to talk. She grasped instinctively that this man's silence was not hollow. It was full. A life so complete in its solitude that words were foreign currency he parted with grudgingly. The cabin surprised her. Solid, well-constructed, warm in ways she had not anticipated from a man who appeared built entirely of stone and quiet. Books lined a shelf above the fireplace. Poetry, history, a Bible worn soft, its passages marked in pencil. The inside of that cabin told a story the outside of that man kept hidden. The story of someone who thought in depths, who felt in depths, who had chosen isolation not from inability to connect, but because connection frightened him worse than any grizzly or blizzard ever had. Autumn deepened around them. Aspens flared gold, then went bare. Snow materialized on the peaks and crept toward the valley with the slow certainty of something that had performed this descent 10,000 times and would perform it 10,000 more. A rhythm took shape between them. He trapped. She cooked. He brought meat down from the ridges. She preserved it. He mended the cabin walls. She organized its interior with a precision that transformed raw shelter into something closer to home. Evenings they ate together beside the fire, and the silence between them shifted in texture. Less like absence now, more like presence. The stillness between two people who have no use for language, because closeness and constancy and the slow weight of shared mornings have already said everything. She catalogued him without meaning to, how he pulled his boots off before crossing the threshold, as though the space she kept deserved that courtesy. How wildflowers appeared on the table with no explanation attached. How he read poetry beside the fire, lips shaping each line without sound, like confessions he wasn't yet brave enough to voice. He catalogued her in return, the humming while she cooked, songs from a life he'd never touched. The way she stood in the doorway every dawn and studied the peaks like a woman seeing them brand new. The way her laughter arrived unannounced, unprovoked, filling the cabin the way flame filled it, with heat and glow and the specific mercy of something alive against the cold. The fracture in his soul widened, not with pain, with tenderness. The way petals part, the way morning comes, so slow the turning point stays invisible, and only the aftermath is undeniable. Winter came down hard. Snow swallowed the valley whole. The trails sealed shut. The world shrank to the cabin, the woodpile, the frozen creek, and two people sharing a life built for one man who had been certain one was enough. A December evening. She found the poetry book lying open, a line freshly underscored in pencil. She read it by firelight, while he busied himself with a trap that needed no repair. The passage spoke of water found in desert country, of warmth discovered where no warmth should exist, of a soul's ability to unseal itself after years spent locked. She closed the cover, crossed the small room, laid her hand over his, scarred, rough, enormous, still pretending to fix what was already whole. "You still cannot buy me," she whispered. His dark eyes found her brown ones. "I'm not trying to buy you," he said. "Then what are you doing?" The fire spoke. Snow pressed itself against the glass. Mountain silence folded around the cabin like something ancient and watchful. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "I do not know the right words, never needed them before. I have only the wrong ones, but I am asking." Her fingers tightened over his. Firelight caught the shine in her eyes. "You found the right ones," she said quietly. "You found them in the dust outside a general store, when you said the wrong thing and meant the right thing." I laughed because no one had ever been that honest with me. They married in spring. The snow pulled back, and the valley showed its face again, green, raw, impossibly beautiful after months of white. No preacher, no witnesses, just words spoken beside the creek while snowmelt rushed past, carrying winter downstream. Years settled over them the way mountain light settles, gentle, golden. A daughter came first, then a son. The cabin grew. Laughter filled the valley the way birdsong did, naturally, without effort, without invitation. Nora grew strong in that thin air. Her body reclaimed what hunger had stolen. Her face carried the particular beauty that comes when a person stands exactly where they belong. Her laugh never changed, sudden, warm, the sound that had split open a mountain man's soul and let the light flood through. Elijah chords softened in ways only she could read. The silence persisted, but its nature shifted. It became the silence of fullness instead of absence, the quiet of a man who holds everything he needs inside walls he raised with hands that once believed survival was their only calling. Travelers who drifted through the valley in later years sometimes mentioned the homestead up in the mountains, the stone cabin beside Bridger Creek, the tall, quiet man, and the dark-haired woman whose laugh traveled across the water, children running through the pines as though the wilderness were a garden grown just for them. They said the man carried a scar along his jaw and poetry on his shelf, that he possessed a gentleness which contradicted his size, the way a spring contradicts the rock it breaks through. They said the woman would tell it sometimes, a story about a day in the dust outside a general store, how a mountain man asked her the wrong question, how she laughed, and how that laugh traveled through the years the way a river cuts through canyon rock, shaping everything it touched, slowly, gently, permanently. Some people search the whole world for what they need. They cross oceans, deserts, entire mountain ranges hunting the thing that will make their life complete. Others find it in the dirt outside a trading post, in a clumsy question and a genuine laugh, in the simple, terrifying act of saying the wrong words to the right person, and discovering those wrong words were exactly right, because they were honest. And honesty is the only language the heart has ever recognized. Can I buy you? No, you cannot. But you can sit beside me while I eat the stew you purchased. You can walk me into your mountains. You can show me your poetry and your silence, and that cabin you built for one person, the one that always had room for two. You can ask me to stay using words you have never spoken before, and I will stay. Not because you bought me, because you broke yourself open in front of me and let me see what lived inside. And what lived inside was worth more than gold. That is what the mountains remember. Not the harshness, not the cold, not the winters that test the absolute limit of what living things can endure. Nora, the mountains remember the laughter. A girl in the dust, a man on his knees without kneeling, a question asked wrong and answered right, the sound of something cracking open that was never meant to stay closed. The valley still holds her laugh. If you listen closely where Bridger Creek bends past the old stone foundation, you can hear it, mixed with snowmelt and birdsong and the quiet breathing of mountains that have kept this story since before anyone thought to write it down. Some say the cabin still stands. Some say only the chimney remains. But the laugh survives. It always survives.